Okay, we're going to go over dimensional analysis today. Dimensional analysis is a problem-solving tool, which is kind of the first kind of foundational part of stoichiometry. And stoichiometry is one of those capstone units. It's a big, big deal in chemistry, and it kind of permeates all the other units. Like we can be in gas laws, and we can still be asking stoichiometry problems. So dimensional analysis then becomes a really important part of stoichiometry, and then stoichiometry is kind of important throughout the rest of chemistry. But dimensional analysis is actually based off of two rules, both of which you could kind of learn in elementary school if you really, really wanted to. Rule number one is that if you've got a number on the top and the bottom, or a unit on the top and the bottom, you can always cross it out. So for example, if I have 5 halves and I multiply it by 2 sevenths, I can cross out the 2 because it's in the numerator and the denominator. It's in both places, so I can cross it out. And I think we're used to that from a number sense, but it can be anything, all right? So later on, if I want to say 5 divided by frowny face times frowny face divided by 7, I can say, oh, the frowny face is on top, the frowny face is on bottom, so I can cross it out. So the important concept here is anytime it's a number, it's a unit, it's on the top and it's on the bottom, we can just kind of cross that out. So that's rule number one. Something can cross out, and in our case, it'll be that something does cross out. And then rule number two is that anytime you multiply things that are equal to 1, it's like you haven't done anything at all. So what do I mean by this? Let's say we take a definition we all know. If I have a dozen cookies, then I have 12 cookies. Everything in the world is about food to me, okay? So if I had 1 dozen divided by 1 dozen, then I would say, hey, a dozen divided by a dozen equals 1. Anything divided by itself is always 1. If I had written 12 cookies and said, oops, divided by 12 cookies, I would still say, hey, that also equals 1. Well, since I know 1 dozen cookies equals 12 cookies, I have a third way to write this. I can say 12 cookies divided by 1 dozen, that actually equals 1. It's the same statement as saying 1 dozen divided by 1 dozen, or 12 cookies divided by 12 cookies. And I could flip this and I would still be true. 1 dozen divided by 12 cookies, this also equals 1. So these two things, they're kind of statements of 1, all right? We call these conversion factors. They are things that when we're doing dimensional analysis help us convert from one thing into another. And in chemistry, we're frequently going to be using them in terms of atoms or grams or even nanometers, nanograms. But I like to always start with something that makes a little bit more sense, okay? So we're going to start with a question that we can almost do in our heads, and that is, if I have 3 dozen cookies, how many cookies do I actually have, all right? So I always start off by writing what I have. I have 3 dozen. That's what's given to me in the problem. Rule number 1 tells me that something must cross out. So I say to myself, I got to get rid of the word dozen because I don't want to be in that word. I want to be in the word cookies, okay? So I follow my rules and I say dozen is currently on the top. Rule number 1 says something must cross out. So the word dozen must go on the bottom, all right? Because when I have something on the top and on the bottom, and I can force that to look like a fraction if that helps you out. If I have something on the top and the bottom, then I can cross out, just like when it's happy face or 2 or whatever it is. The second rule says I must multiply by things that equal 1. I can't fundamentally change how much I have, which is 3 dozen, so I must multiply it by 1 so that it keeps its value. So then I say to myself, okay, I've got dozen on the bottom. What equals 1 dozen? Well, I know 12 cookies are in a dozen. And when I'm first starting out, I will frequently write an equal sign here just to remind myself that it has to equal 1. Does 12 cookies equals 1 dozen? Yes, it does. Can something cross out? Yes, it can. So then I get 3 times 12 is 36, and the word that I have left is cookies. All right? And we can end up doing this for all sorts of things. I can say to myself, I make $10 an hour. And one of the key things that I would suggest as a hint is we're quite often used to saying $10 per hour like this, just like I might say 60 mph for miles per hour. I might write that as 60 miles per hour, like that. I would say it's very, very, very helpful to get used to writing fractions as top over bottom as opposed to in the slanted fraction. So I would say $10, that's how much I make in 1 hour. And I might say, well, if I worked nonstop for 7 days, I just didn't even sleep at all, how much money would I make? So then I would say, okay, I want to know how many dollars that is in a week. And I'm always going to follow my same rules. I'm going to say, okay, I want it to be in dollars. I'm in dollars in my answer over here, so I'm going to leave dollars alone. But I'm in hours right now, and I want to be in weeks. So rule number one, something must cross out. So I say, okay, I don't want to cross out dollars because that's what I want my final answer to be in. But I do actually want to cross out hours. So hour is currently on the bottom. For me to be able to cross it out, that word is going to have to go on top. That's rule number one. Something must cross out. Rule number two says I must multiply by things that are equal to 1. So do I know how many hours are in a week? You might, but I don't. So I would say 24 hours equals 1 day. Again, I write a little equal sign there just to make sure that I'm reminding myself that I must be multiplying by things that equal 1. So hour and hour cross out, so I've satisfied rule number 1. 24 hours equals 1 day, so I've satisfied rule number 2. But I'm actually not there at my answer yet. I can say, okay, I wanted dollars per week, and I have now dollars over days. So then I've got to, again, go another step, and I say, okay, days currently on the bottom, something has to cross out, so that means days is going to go on the top. All right? And then rule number 2 says I must multiply by things that equal 1. Well, in this case, I'm in luck, because I look at my answer, and I want it to be in weeks, and I know that 7 days equals 1 week. Again, I satisfied rule number 1 because something crosses out. Something was on top, that same something was on the bottom. And I satisfied rule number 2 because 7 days equals 1 week. So then I would just do out this math, and it's whatever 70 times 220 times 24 is dollars per week. And so my final answer would, I think, I can do math, $1,680. And if now you wanted to write it in the slanted fashion, you could and say I make $1,680 per week. So that's more or less dimensional analysis in a nutshell. I'll post at some point some practice problems so that you guys can work through it and give me questions if you have them.